There have famously been quite a few animated Disney movies over the years to be looked on in a better light years after they first came out, with many arguing that they deserve to be more well known than they actually are. And perhaps one of the most prominent and deserved examples of this would be The Emperor's New Groove. Though mostly overlooked in its day, with quite a few Disney fans finding it too different from their usual style, The Emperor's New Groove has gone on to gain a major cult following, with many people hailing it as one of Disney's funniest and most underrated movies to date. And I believe that a major reason for this reevaluation has to do with the fact that the movie was actually pretty ahead of its time in many regards, especially when it comes to its style of humor. And today, I'd like to go over this topic in more detail, specifically why it took some time for The Emperor's New Groove to find its audience. And obviously there will be spoilers for this movie ahead. So in case you haven't seen it yet and don't want to know what happens, then you should probably come back to this video another day. Okay, so as any fan of The Emperor's New Groove will already know, the movie wasn't originally meant to be such a raw slapstick comedy. Instead, it started out as a sweeping epic based off Mark Twain's The Prince and the Pauper called The Kingdom of the Sun, which would have told the story of a prince being turned into a llama with a peasant being forced to take his place while the evil sorceress Yzma planned to extinguish the sun so that she could remain young and beautiful forever. Now, while a potentially interesting concept on paper, the problem was that nobody could agree on anything, and as production went further along, it was obvious that the whole thing was going to be a disaster. And what also didn't help was the presence of Mark Dingdall, who was pushing for a more comedic approach to the material. So with all these clashing visions, and the story shaping up to be one of the worst in Disney history, production was halted despite half the animation already being completed, and everything was brought back to the drawing boards. After that, Mark Dingdall was given free rein to do what he wanted, and the results were the much lighter comedy everybody now knows, The Emperor's New Groove. And no matter how one feels about the movie, one can't deny that it most definitely succeeds in its goal of being funny. But as I touched on earlier, I just don't think that audiences in 2000 were really ready for it. Because when it came out, Disney was still riding off the success of the Disney Renaissance, which contained some of Disney's most poignant, dramatic movies up until that point, making something like The Emperor's New Groove, a movie that goes out of its way not to treat pretty much anything in it seriously, feel pretty jarring and out of place for fans of those previous movies. And not to mention, even the style of humor it employs isn't one that would really become popular until a few years later. Because as everybody once again already knows, Shrek was the movie that really changed the name of the animation game when it came out in 2001, which was the year after The Emperor's New Groove came out. And as many have noted, the two actually have a lot in common, but with one major difference. One was a CGI movie made by an animation studio with no precedents to live up to, while the other was a traditionally animated movie that was very different from what its company over the last 60 years at that point was known for. My point is, when you look at these factors, it's really no wonder why Shrek was such a pop culture phenomenon, while The Emperor's New Groove took longer to be appreciated. But in an ironic twist of fate, the success of Shrek probably helped The Emperor's New Groove become appreciated in the long run, because it was really that movie that popularized the style of humor that The Emperor's New Groove had utilized. And by 2005, almost every animated movie out there was trying to be like Shrek, being a buddy comedy and parody of classic animated movies and genres, all of which The Emperor's New Groove had already been 5 years prior. And not to mention, around the same time, that really fast, zany and nonsensical style of comedy that harkens back to the really crazy Looney Tunes cartoons of the 40s and 50s had just become more popular in animated movies in general, with it not being uncommon for even serious animated works to engage in quite a bit of slapstick. But despite all of this helping The Emperor's New Groove's reputation improve over the years, there's still one other really important factor that helped it gain some newfound recognition. It was actually good. Even better than most Shrek imitators, in fact. Now sure, some of that does come down to the fact that it wasn't trying to be a Shrek imitator because it came out first, but the thing is, it also manages to succeed really well where most other movies of its nature, animated or otherwise, tend to fail, which is mainly in the fact that the dynamic between Kuzco and Pacha actually works. Because most buddy comedies' fatal flaw is that they end up making both characters too sympathetic, which makes it rather confusing when the narrative says one needs to learn something from the other. But not in this movie, because here, Kuzco is an extremely bratty, borderline sociopathic narcissist who only cares about himself because as the Emperor, he's been waited on hand and foot his entire life and has thus developed the mentality that he and his many whims are the only thing that matters. While on the flip side, Pacha is the nicest guy you could ever possibly meet, and pretty much the only type of person who would have the kindness or patience to give somebody like Kuzco a chance. And as a result, the main story of Kuzco learning to become a better person because of Pacha's influence actually holds water because they're so firmly on opposite ends of the spectrum from the start, and particularly because Kuzco is such a horrible person at first. Again, unlike most other movies of this nature, there is actually major room for improvement on his part. And for such a raw comedy, it actually plays his transition really well. And in addition to telling that story very effectively, the humor is also very timeless as well. Because just by watching the movie, one would never know when it was made, and as a result makes it just as funny now as when it was released. Which was another major advantage it had when people went back and watched it years after the fact. Because the comedy hadn't aged, it was just as easy to enjoy it as when it came out, and will still make for really funny viewing even decades down the line. My point is, the movies with the most universal and timeless humor tend to stand the test of time the best, because anybody can watch it no matter the time or place and find it just as funny as when it came out. And that is something The Emperor's New Groove pulls off with flying colors. To put it simply, let's just say that it may have been made in the late 1990s and set in ancient Peru, but the humor is never indicative of either of those things. And for a comedy like this, that's all to the good. And like I said before, majorly adds to its appeal. Now, obviously, there are other factors I can get into as well, such as the many excellent performances by the voice cast, as well as having one of the greatest and most memorable Disney villains of the new millennium, and even the animation complementing both the characters and jokes really well. But I think I've already made my point, which is that even though it was arguably ahead of the curve when it came to the kinds of movies audiences would want from animation studios, The Emperor's New Groove still has proven itself to be a timeless comedy classic that honestly deserves to be more well known. Though, if I'm being honest, it was probably better off coming out when it did, even if it was before audiences were ready for it, because if it had come out later on, when movies like it had become the norm, it may very well have fallen into the same pitfalls that many a Shrek imitator infamously did, as I mentioned earlier, and probably wouldn't have been nearly as good because of it. So in the end, even if it arguably suffered from coming out too soon, in the long run, it was still probably much better off for it. Alright, I think that was everything I've got on that. So now I'd like to hear what you guys think. Do you believe that The Emperor's New Groove deserves to be more well known as a comedy classic and was extremely ahead of its time? Or do you believe it's simply an average movie with the reputation it deserves? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below. And remember, you don't have to agree with any opinions expressed in this video if you don't want to. You are entitled to your own opinion, and if you think I've got the whole thing backwards, that's absolutely fine. And thank you all for watching. It is very much appreciated, and I hope to see you all next time.